right, fine. Let's give this a shot. Now, unfortunately, this is done in such a manner as that the ironic thing is, first of all, I will say that the clip that's coming up is 2 minutes and 7 seconds. And the way it's coming up apparently is on an Arabic language station that makes it look like the subject, is actually wearing an armband with the insignia of the media outlet on his arm, his left arm, his right arm, right underneath his airborne patch. So let's see what happens.
When it comes to General David Petraeus, these senators couldn't be more clear.
There's nobody better equipped to do this job than you.
I see. So actually, we're not even talking about Petraeus in his performance as a theater commander or anything having to do with his military duty. What we're talking about is his PR quality.
I have tremendous confidence in you. You're an American hero.
But the president's policy in Afghanistan is not getting the same approval.
Okay, so we're talking about him as a reflection of the president's policy based upon the accolades he gets as a member of the military, which is supposed to reflect on the commander in chief. This is very telling, actually.
One of the big issues, the rules of engagement. General Stanley McChrystal put limits on the actions troops could take and said the priority should be protecting civilians.
As clearly as I can say this, there are no circumstances, none, in which we should put our people unreasonably at risk where they cannot take actions in order to protect themselves.
Petraeus promised to review the policy that he approved, but only to a point.
This is not conventional combat. And if there are civilians in the house, if you don't know who's in the house, you really do need to think twice before you take out the house. If that fire on you is not pinning you down, maybe you want to break contact, keep the house under observation for a while.
So, maybe you want to break contact and keep the house under observation for a while. I see. So, the concern here, the primary concern, is that if you're not aware of and you haven't confirmed who's in the house, then an understanding of going in and, shall we say, clearing the room of hostiles is not the primary consideration. So how long is it considered an appropriate policy to isolate and observe someone before you understand whether or not you have title to consider them a hostile available for whatever the necessary action is in order to clear the house?
The issue of when the war will end took center stage. The president promised that the additional 30,000 troops would begin withdrawing in July of 2011, based on conditions on the ground. Senators are split on what that really means.
I imagine they would be. In June of 2010, I was under observation. Now, they did not disclose whether or not there were any cameras, but there were meetings every day, 3 times a day at specific times, some of which had specific topics and some of which did not. And then there was the necessary check-in with the person who administered the medication. Then there was the occasional field trip down the street to the library that I do understand had cameras and had surveillance. Now, at some point, I took it upon myself to perform what might be considered, a reconnaissance role? When I asked for permission to be able to leave and have my own schedule so that I could go up the street to a different area that would then have access to or be accessible to other kinds of surveillance technologies or other kinds of, shall we say, observation. And then would participate in the processes of acquiring information that I composed into articles, as well as participating in the processes of laying out the paper. And I continued with my reconnaissance role even after I left the specific facility. But it does seem that all the way up until September of 2020, which is more than 10 years. So far, there has been no rescission of or no reconsideration of the policy regarding break contact and observe. And yet, it does not seem that either A, it has been asserted definitively that I am a target eligible for house clearing, or B, that I think that's really all that needs to be considered. Why has nobody made contact in 10 years? Why is every effort I have made to make contact been obstructed and prevented for 10 years. It's already understood that my connection with Afghanistan and strategy connected to Afghanistan predated the president being considered in this particular report. And the president being considered in this particular report predated the two, or at least the one now, since this report, and the third since the original president of concern. So why has nobody decided that either A, I'm eligible to be considered as a hostile for house clearing, which would make a lot of things more convenient, or B, that it's an appropriate time to reconsider the process of breaking contact?
And somebody needs to get it straight without doubt what the hell we're going to do come July, because I think it determines whether or not someone in Afghanistan is going to stay in the fight.
Whether or not someone in Afghanistan is going to stay in the fight. Well, what were the objectives? The objectives I've seen in the most recent Afghanistan strategy provided by the president are an index with specific socioeconomic variables assigned a specific metric. And the problem is, the primary basis, as I understand it, for the success of such an econometrics is not about econometrics. It is about a paradigm that presumably right now has been sanctioned, but in the processes of being sanctioned has been defamed, debased, and completely misrepresented. And so we have an inherent and implicit policy of sabotaging that which would we identify as being an appropriate war strategy in and of itself. What is the purpose?
That July 2011 date imparts a necessary sense of urgency to Afghan leaders about the need to take on principal responsibility for their country's security.
Interesting. Principal responsibility. Because now, nearly 10 years after that deadline, or what's going on 9 years and a month after that deadline, principal implies who do we identify as the principals in this criminal conspiracy?
Petraeus tried to stay in the middle of that fight.
It was for audiences in Kabul, who again needed to be reminded that won't be there forever.
You know what else won't be there forever? The role of the current Secretary of State. The current Secretary of State, who abused his position as director of the CIA in order to set up resources and assets that he should not have had access to, at least not in the manner he did, and then completely misappropriated them in order to aid and abet a criminal conspiracy rather than applying it to what it was initially intended for.
But we
Oh, by the way, that was actually an Afghanistan strategy.
will be there, and presumably for quite some time.
The lack of an answer unlikely to hold up Petraeus' confirmation, expected to be approved and on the battlefield by the end of this week. Patty Gulhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, if I'm correct, before there was any sort of resolution on the success or the lack thereof regarding the United States strategy in Afghanistan, somebody had been accused of serious sexual improprieties, which I'm certain made very delightful underwriting for some when it came to the pension system, but didn't do a lot in the way of making sure to fulfill any measurable objectives in Afghanistan or pretty much anywhere else in that area. Now, the problem I'm having is that, unfortunately, in this whole paradigm, I was supposed to be on the other side. And I need to check my emotions. And so I'm having a hard time. I'm distressed because for so long I've been under observation and been associated with being distressed and with being agitated with pressured speech. And I've had so much projected onto me as being troubled and in need of someone else's assistance that when I'm viewing somebody else that I'm supposed to be scrutinizing for their performance, I get confused. Right? I think that somehow I'm supposed to be analyzing policy. And I'm supposed to be discussing and contemplating what it means to reasonably and responsibly engage in policy decisions at that level. Instead of remembering that I'm really in need of somebody to help me because I'm really unstable and because I just don't know how to do it on my own. And I'm probably at this point like off my meds for way too long. And so there's no way I could possibly have a rational conversation with anybody, much less give an analysis of important policy issues like that. And there's this whole thing about me and my feet because I had these foot problems for a long time. And somehow it ended up being connected to people in Afghanistan. And nobody wants to talk about that. So do we have another hearing coming up? Do we have a podiatrist that can help me with my Afghanistan strategy?